The year is 2013, and competition in the mobile phone sector is extreme. Devices running Windows Phone, BlackBerry OS, Firefox OS, Migo, Ubuntu, and even Symbian were the norm. But at the same time, 2013 was the year we had the current Android iOS duopoly finally consolidate. And one of the phones that made the biggest impact that year was the iPhone 5S, which cemented iOS as one of the winners in that tournament of power that was that platform war. With a beautiful design, a refreshed and well thought out user interface, the first 64-bit processor in a phone, a reliable fingerprint sensor, and an incredible camera, the iPhone 5S made such a big impact that it went on to become one of the best-selling smartphones of 2013. Back then, I was a kid, and like probably most people my age watching this, didn't have enough money to buy one when it launched. But over 10 years later, I finally gave in to the temptation and bought an iPhone 5S a year ago, which I've been using all this time to answer the question, is the iPhone 5S still usable today? And even before we start, I can already spoil the answer by saying that I found more issues than I initially expected. The iPhone 5 is the last iPhone Steve Jobs was closely involved in its creation before his passing, with the iPhone 6 as probably the last one overseen by him, since companies usually have products in the making many years before they're released. Since the iPhone 5S is in a sense a supercharged version of the iPhone 5, you could say it's one of the last products that had that Steve Jobs touch alongside the iPhone SE. If you look at the iPhone 5 and 5S from the back, they're almost indistinguishable from one another, apart from the two-tone flash. However, from the front, it's a bit easier to tell them apart thanks to the first generation fingerprint sensor, which, to my surprise, still works very well. It struggles quite a bit if your finger is dirty or wet, but it's honestly far better than the in-display fingerprint sensor on my Pixel 6 Pro. With just a quick glance, you can see the extraordinary dedication and work Apple put into the design. Everything from the excellent build quality and how great it feels in the hand, to the well thought out integration of hardware and software, all reflects meticulous attention to detail, and it's something I've always admired about Apple. But this time they truly outdid themselves with 5S, and at the end, this is what really set them apart from the competition. No other phone in 2013 was able to achieve this level of integration, with the closest I can think of being the HTC One M7. Back then, and honestly even now, I was blown away by what they accomplished. Being able to fit inside this tiny body all the power of a high-performance computer was nothing but amazing. If this iPhone was released in like 2004, it would have been considered a supercomputer. That combination of glass and metal, man, how can you not fall in love with that? The edges are flat, and this flat design was so good that Apple brought it back in their iPhones, even though it makes less sense to have a flat frame on larger devices. I also really like that it has rounder corners, which prevent them from digging into your palms, making it very comfortable and easy to hold. And speaking of the frame, there's something I've been wondering. What happened to that app that used the flat base of the phone to spin and take 360-degree panoramic photos? I remember seeing it on the Shark Tank when it first aired, and it completely blew my mind. Years later, I finally got my hands on an iPhone 5S and wanted to try it out, but the app is gone. Does anyone know what happened to it? Also, I really love the circular metal buttons on this phone. Why did they stop making them like this? Even after a decade, they still feel solid, responsive, and have such a satisfying click. They just press down so nicely. Then there's the now extinct mute switch, which has been replaced by the action button in newer models. At the bottom you'll find a headphone jack, pretty much an endangered species at this point, alongside the microphone, lightning port, and speaker. For all these reasons and more, if I had to choose the most beautiful iPhone ever, it would have to be this one. That said, nothing in this world is perfect, and this design has a small flaw. Over time, dust, lint, or other particles from the environment can find their way inside the phone. Slowly but surely, it builds up. In my case, debris has made its way into the selfie camera, completely ruining the photos. I have no idea how it got in there, but it's definitely a design flaw. Another thing I'm not too fond of is that the back panel isn't easily accessible, unlike some of its competitors at the time. But to be fair, removing the screen to change the battery or make repairs is fairly easy if you have the right tool and a bit of patience. I wish it was this easy to work on modern phones. Apple, when deciding what screen to use, was like, let's just reuse last year's screen. No one will notice the difference. And so we didn't get any real upgrade in this department. What's even more interesting is that they even reused the same screen for the iPhone SE. And according to iFixit, the displays are interchangeable between the two models. But I can see why they did that. This 4-inch screen still looks pretty decent, even by today's standards. It has better viewing angles and color reproduction than some mid-range Chinese phones. The iPhone 5s tops out at 579 nits, which is about a quarter what modern iPhones can achieve, and roughly the same as the Steam Deck or ROG Ally. Sure, if you put it under direct sunlight at noon, it's not gonna be enough, but 95% of the time, it's gonna be just fine. For example, here at midday under a cloudy sky, most things on the screen are still legible. That said, one thing I don't like is that over time the screen edges start to yellow, and it seems like this yellow goop gradually spreads toward the center, and it ruins the good whites the screen once had. From what I've seen, this is a very common defect across all the entire iPhone 5 series, including the SE. The iPhone 5s was the first to say goodbye to this skeuomorphism era, marking the end of Steve Jobs' design philosophy. It was Steve who embraced skeuomorphism, using it to make Apple's product feel familiar and intuitive, so even first-time users could find their devices easy to use. This approach gave Apple a chance to make a permanent impact on their users. That's why you had icons and menus resembling real-world objects people could instantly recognize. With iOS 7, skeuomorphism was finally abandoned, replaced by a flatter, more modern design. Apps stopped mimicking their real-life counterparts like it was the case for the Notes app or the Music app. These changes didn't sit well with everyone. Many people who loved and were used to the good old skeuomorphic interface weren't that happy, sparking heated debates in the community at the time. But in the end, it didn't matter. The flat design was here to stay, and here I am rocking that flat design on my old iPhone 5s. And I've gotta say, iOS 12 doesn't look very different from iOS 7, except for minor tweaks like the control center. That said, some interface elements felt a bit unfinished. For example, you couldn't directly access Wi-Fi or Bluetooth settings from the control center, a feature that wasn't added until iOS 15. Back then, this was probably very annoying for a lot of users. You can also spot a few design elements that don't quite fit with the rest of the interface. Take the wallpaper section, for instance, where you see these two options inside a box like layout. These feel like leftovers from an older design era, and now they've been cleaned up in newer versions of iOS. The iPhone 5s, thanks to being the first iPhone with a 64-bit processor, had one of the longest lifespans of any iPhone, receiving as many updates as the iPhone 6, which came out a year later. In January 2023, the 5s got its last security update, meaning it got pretty much a decade worth of software support. However, the last major update for the iPhone 5s was iOS 12, released in late 2018. This version is still usable today, but it's rapidly becoming obsolete, even faster than older Android versions like Android 5 or 6 from 2014. And this is one of the biggest downsides of iPhones. Once they stop getting major updates, developers quickly abandon old versions and unsupported iPhones rapidly become unusable. Alright, but the real question is, how usable is the iPhone 5s a decade later? And the answer comes down to things like what are you gonna use it for, and even what region you live in. In some parts of the world, we can't even use it for basic calls anymore. Many carriers require you to have a device that supports voice over LTE to work. In these regions, the iPhone 5s doesn't even work as a basic phone anymore, unless you connect it to Wi-Fi. But even then, it's tricky because the iPhone 5s is not compatible with Wi-Fi 5 or 6. So you need to connect it to a 2.4 GHz network and lower your security standard to WPA2. Otherwise, it just won't work. And my iPhone can still access 2G, 3G, and 4G LTE networks without any issues. I imagine this is the case for most countries in the world, except for the US. However, iOS is not perfect, and I had to deal with an error that suddenly showed up out of nowhere, preventing me from using cellular services. It was about an update or something, but there was no new update for this iPhone, and it was working just fine before. Nothing I tried to fix it worked, so I had no choice but to restore my iPhone using iTunes. And as you probably know, that program is a pain in the ass to use on Windows. Every time I want to use this thing, there's always something wrong with it. And this time it was buggy drivers. But fortunately, restoring my iPhone fixed the problem. When it comes to daily driving on this phone, a lot of apps are no longer compatible. On iOS 12, if you didn't download these apps back in the day or don't have access to your iPhone to add them to your library, it's pretty much impossible to download even older versions. Thankfully, I bought an iPhone 7 Plus, otherwise I would have been doomed. One of these apps is YouTube, which now requires at least iOS 15. For now, the app works perfectly. We can crank the resolution all the way up to 1080p 60 and even speed it up to 2x without any stutters. This goes to show just how powerful the Apple A7 chip was at the time. No other phone from 2013 is able to pull this off. The downside though is that the YouTube app is no longer getting any new updates and will probably stop working in 2 or 3 years. By then we'll have to rely on a browser. Another issue, at least with my unit, is that the speaker is slightly clogged and therefore doesn't sound as loud as it should be. I cleaned it to the best of my ability, but I could only do so much. But even like this, the sound quality was actually not terrible. It really was better than I expected, especially for a phone from 2013 with a single speaker. I tried other social media apps like Instagram, which now also requires iOS 15. It works fine even when I scroll through reels really fast. Some of them take a bit of time to load, but nothing I would deem unusable. Snapchat now requires iOS 13, but an older version of the app is still usable. For now it works to an extent. If you push it too hard though, it will force close the app. So I would only limit the usage to watching other people's content. WhatsApp is on its last legs right now, with iOS 12 being the oldest version it supports. And even that will not last forever since it will stop working on iOS 12 by May 2025. Which is so lame because WhatsApp works even on Android 5, a version from 2014, which is roughly equivalent to iOS 8. Fortunately, if you are an iPhone user and depending on where you live, iMessage and FaceTime seem to have plenty of life left. But there's something you can do with the iPhone 5s that you can't with your modern iPhone. This. Enjoy your music with a nice pair of wired headphones. For web browsing, thanks to our friends at Firefox who still support iOS 12, we can surf the internet without any issues. For a phone over 10 years old, web browsing is actually fairly smooth overall. It even loads the Apple website just fine. The 5S in terms of speed is comparable to 2016 high-end Android smartphones. There's a little bit of lag when switching between tabs, but nothing too crazy. A big surprise was that CapCut still supports iOS 12, so you can still edit your videos and export them to be used for TikTok or YouTube. The app takes a bit of time to open, and adding effects or even text is enough to make it lag a little bit. But it's definitely usable in this thing. It's amazing that it works at all. One thing I saw myself using the iPhone 5S for was Strava. When I go jogging or cycling, modern phones are so big and heavy they drag down my pants, and I have to constantly pull them up. I imagine more than one person has ended up showing something they didn't want to show because of this. The iPhone 5S with its size would have been ideal for Strava. Unfortunately, the app no longer gets any new updates. It was working fine until August 2024, but then it stopped tracking my progress in real time. It was like that for weeks, and I thought it had stopped working entirely. Then I discovered that it was still tracking my route, but for whatever reason you needed to restart the phone to see the progress. It was very weird, but even weirder is that it worked again, but this time with a new issue. If you close the app or turn off the phone, this time it erases all your progress. I guess these inconsistencies occur because the app has not been updated in a long time. The battery on this phone 11 years later is pretty worn out. I imagine the person I bought it from didn't go easy on it, as the battery doesn't even reach 30% before shutting down. For YouTube and other light tasks, it would give me around 2 to 3 hours of screen on time. When I play games, it drops to just 1 hour or even less. So in this area, more so than app incompatibility, is where it has aged the worst. You could replace the battery, but even when it was new, it wasn't a good battery performer. One of the strongest features of this phone in 2013 was the camera, which almost took the crown for best camera that year, if not for the spectacular Nokia 1020 camera. We've got an 8 megapixel sensor with the then novel dual tone flash. Photos in good lighting conditions look pretty decent. For an 8 megapixel camera, it captures a decent amount of detail. They're not perfect, but they could still compete with entry-level smartphones and even some mid-range ones. The white balance tends to be on the warm side, and the colors are somewhat washed out but bright. I don't know, but there's something to these photos that I really like. It's like they bring me back to the past. That said, it's clear how much smartphone cameras have improved ever since. Take this flower for example. In real life it was red, but the iPhone 5S made the flower look pale, and you can barely tell between the petals. I don't know what is it about this flower that is so hard to get right that even modern phones struggle to get correctly. The difference when using HDR is noticeable, but it's not huge as you can see in these examples. You can also take burst photos, capturing hundreds of shots this way. For a 2013 phone, I noticed that the time between you pressing the shutter button and taking the photo is almost instantaneous, something where even some newer phones I've had take a tad longer to do. That said, it only has one camera, so forget about ultra-wide shots. And having such a small sensor when zooming in on things, you won't get the most amazing photo. This is an area where modern phones have vastly improved. Interestingly, in some situations, having a smaller sensor and aperture can be an advantage, like with macro shots. With my Pixel, I have to move farther away and it blurs things I want in focus, like part of the second flower. That just doesn't happen with the iPhone 5s. In low-light conditions, the 5s struggles quite a bit. Detail drops and noise is easily visible. Depending on the situation, it can take acceptable photos, but if you don't hold it steady, your pictures will come out blurry. In more difficult scenarios, like when there's a dark background and strong lights, the results are mediocre. The dual-tone flash, which was one of the selling points at the time, is okay, but ideally you should avoid it. I took some photos in complete darkness and some of them did turn out well. However, there's a small problem. Sometimes the flash creates a white glare to the side of the flash. I don't know if it's just my unit, but I doubt it. All in all, the camera is honestly one of the areas where the iPhone 5s has aged the best. Videos like photos have that warm and slightly vibrant tone, which I personally like a lot. A novelty at the time was being able to record slow motion video at 720p at 120 frames per second. It doesn't sound like much now, but back then, Android phones could barely do slow motion in 480p. When it comes to gaming, being stuck on iOS 12 means the available catalog of games isn't as big as it once was. If you didn't install the games back in the day, forget about playing them now. There are many games that back then ran perfectly on this phone, like the old Dead Trigger 2, but now they won't even open. The same goes for Call of Duty Mobile, Brawl Stars, and many other games I tested which won't work either. This kind of obsolescence is happening right before my eyes. I actually played Clash Royale and it worked perfectly when I bought the phone a couple months ago, but now the guys at Supercell, for whatever reason, decided to increase the minimum version, so rest in peace Clash Royale. Luckily, there's still many games that still run. A game I played a lot back in the day was Bike Race, which uses the gyroscope to move the bike, and the game still works great. Then we have Agar.io, which I hadn't touched in years, and I forgot how fun it was. But the game is full of ads, and that ruins the experience. Surprisingly, Roblox still works. That said, performance is mediocre. The lack of menus is very strong for some reason. But then we have more demanding maps like Doors, which my phone struggles to even open. And when it does, the game only lasts open for a few seconds. Probably it's just a lack of RAM. Then I put the iPhone 5s to the test with Free Fire. I also tested PUBG, and for some reason all the textures were white. But unlike PUBG, it's possible to play Free Fire even with everything on max. Of course, I do not recommend doing this because you'll have occasional frame drops. Still, for a phone from more than 10 years ago, the performance is actually good. If you lower the settings a little bit, then the game will be perfectly playable. But there's another game that still works and that shows how truly powerful the iPhone 5s was at the time. That game is GTA San Andreas, a game that in 2013 no other phone was able to run on max settings. But the 64-bit Apple A7 chip was able to run without breaking a sweat. And I had to confess that one of the reasons why I wanted this phone so bad was to be able to play GTA San Andreas on max settings. The only thing is, it took me over a decade to make my wish come true. A wish that cost me $11 since I can't pirate the game like I did on my Galaxy S3 Mini back then. Emulation wise, unfortunately, there's barely anything we can emulate, as Apple didn't allow emulators in their store until recently. And what I find crazy is that they gave in for whatever reason. Sadly, the only emulator I managed to get working is the PSP one, which happens to be one of the oldest, and thankfully still supports iOS 12. The other emulators, even if they are from very old consoles, won't even let you download an old version, because those old versions simply didn't exist in the App Store due to the emulator embargo. Anyway, Dragon Ball Budokai runs very well, even at 2x resolution. There are small frame drops here and there, but the game is perfectly playable. Beyond that, the screen being this tiny is very uncomfortable to play games on. Moving on, I can't say the same for Manhunt 2. The performance is horrible, and raising the frame skipping beyond 1 not only will not help, but make performance worse instead. So it's best to leave it at 1x, or even better, not play it at all. So if it's this bad, I don't even want to imagine how it'll handle more demanding games like God of War Ghost of Sparta. So let's just leave it here since the iPhone 5s turned out to be a complete disappointment for emulation. And I do think this phone has more than enough power to emulate ATS and PS1, but the lack of emulators kills it. The iPhone 5s was an amazing phone in its day, from its terrific camera and its groundbreaking design to the operating system, which, thanks to being closed, was very polished, and for a good while better than the competition until Android KitKat and Lollipop showed up. One thing I remember fondly from those days was tech events. They always had something new and interesting to show, and if you didn't watch, it felt like you were gonna miss on something big. And we can see they did actually have amazing things to show. In just 4 years, we went from this to this. But smartphones are now mature, and technology has ever since moved on to other things like AI. And a testament of how fast phones were changing is that using a phone from 2001 in 2013 was pretty much impossible. But in the same time skip to now, using the iPhone 5s today is still possible, even though it has aged a lot in some aspects. While it may have its limitations in some areas, we were at a point where phones were getting closer and closer to reaching maturity. But at the end, I think what's holding back the iPhone 5s is not the hardware, but the operating system. Because if I grab a Galaxy S4 from that same year, and even though it's much slower than the iPhone 5s, it's way more usable today even with stock Android 5 ROM. And not to mention if I update it with a custom ROM. If there was a way to put Android on the 5S, today it would be the most capable phone of 2013, and it would be almost as usable as any low-end device today. You just have to see how smooth it goes through the menus compared to the Galaxy S4. The lag in iOS, I don't know how to explain it, but it feels different. It's like it slows down but without laggy starters. Sadly, custom ROMing is not a thing, and obsolescence is gaining ground, and in a couple of years the iPhone 5s will be nothing but an unusable memory. The good thing is that we still have the iPhone SE, which retains the design of the iPhone 5s, but it still has a lot of life left in it, and in a way it keeps the legacy of Steve Jobs alive. That said, because of the iPhone SE's existence, I wouldn't recommend buying an iPhone 5s today, unless you want it as a collection item or enjoy tinkering with older tech as I do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.